How did you escape a kidnapping? I was on my usual morning jog route at 6 in the morning when a white van pulled up next to me on the empty street. The side door slid open before I could even process what was happening. Hands grabbed my arms and yanked me inside so fast my feet left the ground. The door slammed shut and the van took off. There were 2 men in the back with me, and I could see a driver up front separated by a metal partition. I started screaming and kicking as hard as I could. One of them tried to cover my mouth and I bit down on his hand until I tasted blood. He yelled and pulled back. The van was picking up speed and I could feel us getting on the highway. I scrambled toward the door and tried to pull the handle, but one of the men grabbed my legs and dragged me back. I kicked him in the face and hurt his nose crack. He fell backward, cursing. The other man lunged at me with duct tape in his hands. I grabbed his wrist and we struggled. The van swerved and we both fell sideways. I managed to get on top of him and slammed his head against the metal floor. He went limp for a second and I dove for the door again. I pulled the handle as hard as I could, but nothing happened. The door was locked from the outside. The man with the broken nose grabbed me from behind and wrapped his arm around my neck. I couldn't breathe. I threw my head back into his already broken nose and he screamed and let go. I looked around desperately for anything I could use as a weapon. I saw a crowbar on the floor near the back doors. I grabbed it and swung at both of them. Stay back. The one I'd hit in the head was getting up slowly. Blood was running down his face. We're taking you somewhere remote, he said. You can make this easy or you can make it hard, but either way you're coming with us. I swung the crowbar at him and connected with his shoulder. He went down again. The van was going so fast now I could hear the engine roaring. I looked at the partition separating me from the driver. There was a small sliding window in it. If I could get to the driver, maybe I could force him to stop. I started climbing over the men toward the front. One of them grabbed my ankle and I kicked backward with my other foot. I heard him grunt. I reached the partition and slid the window open. The driver glanced back at me. Get her away from there, he yelled. I reached through the window trying to grab the steering wheel, but I couldn't reach it. The men were pulling me back by my legs. I was losing my grip on the partition. Then I saw it. The driver had a coffee cup in the cup holder. I grabbed it and threw the hot coffee in his face. He screamed and let go of the wheel. The van swerved violently and I heard him yelling. One of the men in the back with me was thrown against the side of the van. I pulled myself further through the partition window. The driver was trying to wipe coffee out of his eyes with one hand while reaching for the wheel with the other. I reached through as far as I could and grabbed the wheel myself. I yanked it hard to the right. The driver screamed, "What are you doing?" The van veered across multiple lanes. I could hear cars honking and tires squealing. The men in the back were yelling at me to stop. I held onto the wheel and pulled it even harder. The van tilted up on 2 wheels. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. The van flipped over and I was thrown backward into the back. We rolled at least twice. Metal was crunching and glass was shattering. When we finally stopped, I was on my side pressed against the roof of the van. Everything hurt, but I could move. I looked around and saw the driver slumped over the deflated airbag, not moving. One of the men in the back was unconscious with blood all over his face. The other one was groaning and trying to sit up. The back doors had burst open from the impact. I crawled over the unconscious man and out through the open doors. My hands were cut up from the broken glass and my whole body felt like it had been hit by a truck. I stood up on the highway and looked at the crashed van. Cars had stopped all around us. People were getting out and running toward the wreck. I heard sirens in the distance. The man who'd been groaning climbed out of the van behind me. He looked at me with pure hatred. Then he looked at the driver still not moving in the front seat, and the other man unconscious in the back. He turned and started running away before the police arrived. I just stood there covered in blood and glass staring at what I'd done. Someone grabbed my shoulder and I flinched hard enough to stumble. A paramedic in a blue uniform held up both hands and spoke in a calm voice, but I couldn't process the words over the ringing in my ears. He guided me away from the van toward an ambulance parked on the shoulder. Another paramedic wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, even though I wasn't cold. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't hold the blanket closed. The first paramedic started checking my arms and I watched him pull tiny pieces of glass from my skin with tweezers. It didn't hurt. Nothing hurt yet. I kept looking past him at the overturned van where people were gathering with their phones out taking pictures and videos. This was going to be everywhere. The paramedic asked me questions about where it hurt and if I could remember what happened, but my answers came out jumbled. He cleaned the cuts on my palms with something that stung and wrapped gauze around both hands. The police arrived and started putting up yellow tape around the crash site. I let the paramedics guide me into the ambulance and sat on the stretcher while they checked my vitals. The shaking wouldn't stop. The hospital emergency room was too bright and too loud. A nurse with kind eyes and dark hair pulled back in a ponytail introduced herself as Kathy and led me to a bed behind a curtain. She helped me sit down and started cleaning the glass cuts on my hands and arms more carefully than the paramedics had. Her touch was gentle, but I still winced every time she pulled out another piece of glass. She asked what happened, and I tried to tell her, but the words came out wrong. I started in the middle, then jumped back to the beginning, then forward again. My brain felt scrambled, like I couldn't put the events in order anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the van tilting up on 2 wheels and felt myself being thrown backward. Kathy listened without interrupting and nodded like what I was saying made sense even though I knew it didn't. She cleaned each cut carefully and applied antibiotic cream before covering them with clean bandages. She told me the police were waiting to talk to me, but I needed medical clearance first. The doctors wanted to make sure I didn't have a concussion or internal injuries from the crash. A man in a dark suit knocked on the frame of the curtain area and asked if he could come in. Kathy nodded, and he pulled a chair close to my bed. He introduced himself as Detective Jerome Bray and showed me his badge. His voice was quiet and steady. He explained that one of the kidnappers died at the scene, and another was in critical condition 2 floors below me in this same hospital. The third man who ran away was still missing, and they needed my help identifying him. I tried to describe the man who'd escaped, but everything had happened so fast. I remembered he had dark hair and was maybe 30 years old, and had been trying to put duct tape on me. I told Bray about hitting him with the crowbar and how he'd looked at me with pure hatred before running away. Bray wrote everything down in a small notebook. He asked if I could work with a sketch artist later, and I said yes, even though I wasn't sure I could remember the man's face clearly enough. Bray pulled out his phone and showed me photos. The first one made my stomach drop. It was the driver slumped over the steering wheel covered in blood. Bray asked if I recognized him from anywhere in my life. I studied the face carefully, trying to see past the blood and the injuries. He was a complete stranger. I'd never seen him before that morning when he was driving the van. Bray showed me another photo of the man who was in critical condition downstairs. I didn't recognize him either. These were just random men who'd grabbed me off the street. If this was random, then anyone could have been taken. Any woman jogging alone at 6 in the morning could have been yanked into that van. The thought made me feel sick. Bray put his phone away and told me they were working on identifying the men through fingerprints and trying to figure out why they'd targeted me. He gave me his card and said I could call any time if I remembered anything else. My phone had survived the crash somehow, and I managed to call Adriana with shaking hands. She answered on the first ring, and I barely got the words out before she said she was on her way. She arrived 20 minutes later, and the nurse led her through to my bed area. Adriana took one look at me covered in bandages with cuts all over my arms, and her face crumpled. She started crying, which made me start crying too. We held on to each other, and I felt her shaking as hard as I was. She kept saying she was so glad I was alive over and over. I couldn't stop crying once I started. Everything that had happened hit me all at once, and I sobbed into her shoulder while she held me. She promised I could stay at her place as long as I needed to. She said I wasn't going back to my apartment alone, and she'd already cleared it with her roommate. I was so grateful I couldn't even form words. We stayed like that until a doctor came to check on me. The doctor examined my head where I'd hit it during the crash and said I had a mild concussion. He wanted to keep me overnight for observation to make sure there were no complications. A nurse moved me to a regular room on the 4th floor, and I changed into a hospital gown. There was a police officer stationed outside my door. Seeing him there made everything real in a new way. The escaped kidnapper knew what I looked like. He'd spent time in that van with me. He could come looking for me. Every sound in the hallway made me jump. Footsteps passing by. A cart rolling past. Voices talking. My heart raced each time, and I couldn't calm down. Adriana sat in the chair next to my bed and held my hand. She offered to stay the night, but visiting hours were ending, and the nurse said only one person could stay. Adriana promised to come back first thing in the morning. After she left, I was alone with just the police officer outside and the sounds of the hospital around me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I started to drift off, I was back in the van fighting for my life. I'd feel hands grabbing me and jerk awake, gasping for air. The nurse came in around midnight and offered me medication to help me sleep, but I was too scared to take it. Being unconscious and vulnerable terrified me more than staying awake. What if the escaped kidnapper found a way past the police officer? What if he came for me while I was drugged and couldn't fight back? I spent hours staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the morning. The hands grabbing my arms. The taste of blood when I bit the man's hand. The sound of the nose breaking under my kick. The crowbar in my hands. The coffee cup. The steering wheel. The van tilting. The crash. The blood. I couldn't stop seeing it all over and over. My body ached everywhere, but that pain felt distant compared to the fear that wouldn't leave. The next morning, Detective Bray came back. I could tell from his face that something had changed. He sat in the chair Adriana had used and told me the second kidnapper died during the night from internal injuries. Now 2 men were dead because of what I did. The guilt hit me so hard I couldn't breathe for a second. I'd killed 2 people. They'd been trying to kidnap me and probably kill me, but they were still dead and I was the reason. Bray must have seen something in my face because he leaned forward and said I'd had no choice. He said I'd defended myself and saved my own life. But knowing that didn't make the weight in my chest any lighter. Only one kidnapper was left alive now, and he was the one who got away. He was the only person who could explain why this happened, and he was out there somewhere. Bray told me the crime scene investigators had finished processing the van. They found zip ties and duct tape and a blue tarp in the back, along with my blood where I'd fought them. They were treating this as an attempted kidnapping with intent to harm or kill based on the evidence. The tarp was the detail that made me feel sick. They'd planned to wrap my body in it. Bray said I was incredibly lucky to be alive and that my actions had saved my life. He kept emphasizing that I'd done everything right. But it didn't feel right. It felt like I'd destroyed everything, including myself. He asked if I'd be willing to work with the FBI because they thought this might be connected to other cases. I said yes because maybe if I helped them, it would mean something. Maybe those 2 deaths would lead to something good. The doctor discharged me later that morning with a thick packet of instructions about my injuries. I needed to follow up with my regular doctor in a week and watch for signs of infection in the cuts. They gave me a referral to a trauma therapist and strongly recommended I make an appointment soon. I was wearing hospital scrubs because my jogging clothes were evidence now. Everything I'd been wearing that morning was in a police evidence bag somewhere. Adriana drove me to her apartment and set me up in her spare room. She'd already put fresh sheets on the bed and cleared space in the closet. She helped me into bed and brought me water and crackers because I hadn't eaten since before the kidnapping. I lay there staring at the unfamiliar ceiling and wondered if I'd ever feel normal again. My whole body hurt and my hands were wrapped in so much gauze I could barely use them. But worse than the physical pain was the knowledge that 2 men were dead, and 1 was still out there. And I had no idea why any of this had happened to me. I heard the apartment buzzer around 3 that afternoon and Adriana went to answer it. Heavy footsteps came down the hall, and then my brother Jude was standing in the doorway of the spare room looking at me with this expression I'd never seen before. His face was red and his hands were in fists at his sides. He crossed the room in 2 steps and pulled me into a hug that hurt my ribs, but I didn't care. When he let go, he started pacing back and forth asking Adriana why the police hadn't caught the 3rd guy yet and what they were doing to protect me. His anger felt good somehow, like someone else was carrying part of the weight. He wanted details about everything, and I told him the whole story again while he got more upset with each part. When I got to the part about the man running away, Jude punched the wall hard enough to leave a dent. Adriana made him sit down and brought us all water. Jude kept saying he should have been there and asking what he could do now. I told him there was nothing anyone could do except wait for the police to find the guy. That made him even more angry, but at least his anger was for me instead of at me. That evening, Adriana turned on the local news, and there it was. Footage of the crashed van on the highway with police tape everywhere. The reporter stood in front of the wreck talking about a dramatic escape from kidnappers. They showed the overturned van from multiple angles, and you could see the smashed doors and broken glass. The reporter said a young woman had fought back violently against her attackers and caused the crash that killed 1 kidnapper and left another in critical condition. They didn't show my face or say my name, but they described me as being in my 20s with brown hair. The news anchor in the studio called it a harrowing ordeal and said police were still searching for a 3rd suspect. I watched it all feeling disconnected, like they were talking about someone else. Jude recorded it on his phone. Later that night, I made the mistake of looking at the comments online. Some people were calling me brave and saying I did what I had to do, but others were asking if I really needed to crash the van and if I'd used too much force. Someone wrote that I should have just cooperated and waited for police. Another person said I was responsible for the kidnapper's death even though he was trying to kill me. Reading those comments made my chest tight and I had to put the phone down. My phone rang the next morning while I was trying to eat the toast Adriana had made. It was Detective Bray. He said the FBI was getting involved because they thought my case might be connected to other kidnappings in the area. An agent named Brian Fournier wanted to interview me tomorrow at the police station. Bray said the FBI had resources the local police didn't have, and this could be good for the investigation. I asked him what other kidnappings he meant, and he said he'd let Agent Fournier explain everything. After I hung up, I sat there staring at the phone. The idea that this could be part of something bigger made my skin crawl. I'd thought this was random bad luck, but if it was connected to other cases, then someone had been planning this. Someone had picked me specifically for some reason. That thought made me feel sick all over again. I finally fell asleep that night around midnight but woke up screaming a few hours later. I was back in the van and the men were grabbing me and I couldn't get away. My hands were tangled in the sheets and I was sweating even though Adriana kept her apartment cold. She rushed in wearing pajamas with her hair messy and turned on the light. I was shaking so hard my teeth were chattering. She sat on the edge of the bed and didn't try to touch me, just stayed there while I caught my breath. When I could talk, I told her about the dream. She asked if I wanted her to stay, and I said yes, even though I felt like a little kid. She pulled the chair from the corner over next to the bed and sat there with a blanket. Every time I started to drift off, I'd jerk awake, scared I was back in the van. Adriana stayed in that chair until the sun came up. I watched the window get lighter and felt grateful I'd made it through another night, but scared that I'd never feel safe sleeping again. Detective Bray picked me up at Adriana's the next morning to take me to the police station. Agent Fournier was waiting in an interview room with a laptop and a folder full of papers. He was younger than I expected, with short dark hair and glasses. He shook my hand and thanked me for coming in. Bray sat in the corner while Fournier started asking questions. He wanted to know about my job, and I told him I worked in medical billing at a clinic processing insurance claims. He asked about my daily routine, so I described my morning jogs and my work schedule and how I usually got groceries on Thursdays. He wanted to know about my relationships and whether I'd dated anyone recently or had any conflicts with people. I told him I'd broken up with someone 6 months ago, but it was friendly and we didn't talk anymore. He asked about my family and friends and whether anyone had been acting strange around me. Nothing I said seemed to connect to anything. My life was boring and normal, and there was no reason anyone would target me. Fournier opened the folder and pulled out 3 photos. He slid them across the table one at a time. 3 women around my age, all with brown hair and similar builds. He said they'd all been kidnapped in neighboring states over the past year. The first woman was found dead 2 months after she disappeared. The second one was found dead after 3 weeks. The third woman was still missing and had been gone for 4 months. I stared at the photos, feeling the room spin. They all looked like they could be my sisters or cousins. Fournier said the FBI believed these cases were connected, and that my attackers might be part of the same group. He said I was supposed to be the next victim, but I'd survived because I fought back. The way he said it made it sound like those other women hadn't fought hard enough, but I knew that wasn't what he meant. They'd probably fought just as hard, and it hadn't been enough. I'd just gotten lucky with the coffee cup and the partition window. Looking at those photos of women who looked like me made me understand how close I'd come to being another dead girl in a folder. Later that afternoon, the police released the name and photo of the escaped kidnapper. Sean Norris, age 34, with a record for assault and drug charges. His photo was everywhere on the news and online. I stared at his face on my phone, trying to burn every detail into my memory. He had a scar through his left eyebrow and a tattoo on his neck. This was the man who'd tried to put duct tape on me. The one I'd hit with the crowbar. The one who'd looked at me with pure hatred before running away. Now I knew his name and his face and the fact that he was still out there somewhere. The news said police considered him armed and dangerous, and people should not approach him. I wondered if he was watching the same news coverage and seeing my description. He knew what I looked like, too. He knew I was the reason his partners were dead. That thought kept me awake most of the night. The next day, Detective Bray called to say that a man named Reed Cotton had contacted the police. He said he was the brother of one of the dead kidnappers and wanted to talk to me. Bray told me I didn't have to agree to meet him, and that it might not be a good idea. But something about the way Bray described Reed made me curious. He said Reed didn't seem angry, just confused and sad about how his brother had ended up dead in a kidnapping plot. I asked Bray what he thought, and he said it was my choice. But if I did want to meet Reed, he'd make sure it happened somewhere safe with him present. I thought about it for a few hours. Part of me wanted nothing to do with the family of the men who'd tried to kill me. But another part of me needed to understand how normal people ended up doing something like this. I called Bray back and said I'd meet Reed. We met at a coffee shop 2 days later with Detective Bray sitting at the next table. Reed was in his 40s with gray in his hair, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He thanked me for agreeing to see him, and his voice shook when he talked. He said his brother had lost his job 8 months ago and started getting involved with bad people to make money. Reed had tried to help him, but his brother kept making worse choices. He said he never thought it would lead to kidnapping and murder. Then he looked right at me and said he was sorry for what his brother had tried to do. He said his family didn't blame me for defending myself, and they were ashamed of what had happened. I didn't know what to say. I'd spent days thinking of the kidnappers as monsters, but Reed was sitting there crying about his brother, and suddenly they felt like real people. Reed told me his brother had a daughter who was 7 years old, and now she'd grow up knowing her father died trying to hurt someone. He wasn't asking for anything or trying to make me feel guilty. He just needed to say these things out loud to someone. When he left, I sat there with my coffee feeling worse than I had before. That conversation with Reed changed something. Before I'd been able to think of the dead kidnappers as just bad guys who got what they deserved. But now I knew one of them had a brother who loved him, and a daughter who'd lost her father. I'd killed someone's brother and someone's dad even though I'd had to do it to survive. The guilt that had been sitting in my chest since the hospital got heavier. At night, I'd lie awake thinking about that 7-year-old girl and wondering what she'd been told about how her father died. I'd think about Reed crying in the coffee shop and his family being ashamed. Lexi, the therapist I was supposed to start seeing, kept telling me I'd done nothing wrong, but it didn't feel that way. It felt like I'd destroyed multiple lives even though the alternative was letting them destroy mine. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the van flipping and heard the metal crunching, and knew that in those few seconds I'd changed everything for so many people. The weight of that knowledge made it hard to breathe sometimes. Adriana helped me find a therapist the next day, and I had my first appointment with Lexi Solomon 2 days after meeting Reed. Her office was in a quiet building with soft lighting and comfortable chairs that were supposed to make you feel calm, but I couldn't stop my leg from bouncing. Lexi was younger than I expected, with dark hair pulled back and kind eyes that didn't look at me like I was broken. She asked me to tell her what happened, and I went through the whole story again, from the van to the crash to standing on the highway covered in blood. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she leaned forward and told me that everything I was feeling was completely normal after a life-threatening event. She said the guilt about defending myself was common, but misplaced because I did what I had to do to survive. She explained that my brain was trying to process trauma, and the nightmares were part of that process. I wanted to believe her, but when I went home that night, the nightmares came back worse than before. I saw the van flipping in slow motion and heard the metal crunching and woke up gasping for air. 2 weeks crawled by after the kidnapping attempt, and the police still hadn't found Sean Norris. Agent Fournier called to update me and said they thought he might have left the state, but they were monitoring my apartment building and Adriana's place just in case he came back. The idea of him out there somewhere knowing what I looked like made my skin crawl. I was too scared to go back to my own apartment even though my lease was still active and my stuff was still there. Every time I thought about sleeping in my own bed, I pictured Norris breaking in through the window or waiting in the hallway. Adriana kept saying I could stay as long as I needed, but I could see the strain on her face when she checked the locks 3 times before bed. I tried to return to work at the medical clinic 3 weeks after everything happened. My boss had been understanding about giving me time off, but I needed to feel normal again, and sitting around Adriana's apartment all day was making me worse. The first morning back, I got through checking in and setting up my desk okay. Then a male patient walked too close to me in the hallway and suddenly I couldn't breathe. My vision tunneled and my heart was racing. So fast I thought I was having a heart attack. I pressed myself against the wall and slid down to the floor with my hands over my head. One of the other medical billing staff found me there shaking and called my boss. She drove me back to Adriana's apartment herself and told me to take more time before trying again. I felt like the kidnapping had stolen my normal life, even though I'd escaped with my body intact. That night, Adriana sat down across from me at her kitchen table and admitted she was struggling with having me stay at her place. She said she felt guilty for feeling that way, but she was scared too now. She kept thinking about Norris knowing where she lived because I was there and what if he showed up. She said she loved me and wanted to help, but she was having trouble sleeping and jumping at every sound in the hallway. I told her I understood because I did. I was bringing danger into her life just by being here, and it wasn't fair to her. We both cried and agreed I needed to find somewhere else to stay, but neither of us knew where that would be. The next morning, Detective Bray called with news that changed everything. He said they'd identified DNA from the third kidnapper in the van and run it through their databases. The DNA matched evidence from 2 of the other murder cases Agent Fournier had shown me. Sean Norris wasn't just a kidnapper. He was wanted for multiple homicides, and the FBI had made him a priority target. Bray said they were treating this as a serial killer case now and had agents from 3 states working on finding him. Knowing I'd been targeted by someone who had killed other women made everything even more scary. Those women in the photos hadn't escaped, and I kept thinking about how close I'd come to being another body they found in the woods somewhere. 2 days later, a woman named Monica Haney called and introduced herself as the prosecutor assigned to the case. She said when they caught Norris, I would need to testify about what happened in the van. She walked me through what that would look like, and then warned me that his defense lawyer would likely argue I used too much force by causing the crash. She said they might try to paint me as the aggressor who killed 2 men instead of a victim defending herself. I was so mad I could barely speak. The idea that I might have to defend saving my own life in front of a jury made me want to scream. Monica said she would fight that narrative hard, but I needed to be prepared for them to attack my credibility and my actions. Jude called that same afternoon and said he'd heard from Detective Bray about the serial killer connection. He insisted I move in with him and his wife instead of staying at Adriana's. He said their house had a security system, and he'd taken time off work to be home during the day. His wife Sarah got on the phone and said they had a guest room ready, and I shouldn't argue about it. I agreed because I couldn't keep putting Adriana at risk, and because part of me was relieved to have somewhere safe to go. Jude picked me up the next day and drove me to their house in the suburbs. The security system had cameras on every door and window, and Jude showed me how to arm it from inside the house. 3 weeks passed while I stayed at Jude's house trying to rebuild some kind of normal routine. I saw Lexi twice a week, and she was helping me work through the trauma, but progress was slow. Then Detective Bray called on a Tuesday evening and said they'd tracked Norris to a motel 2 states away. The FBI was moving in to arrest him that night. I spent the next 4 hours sitting on Jude's couch staring at my phone waiting for confirmation. Jude sat with me and Sarah made tea nobody drank. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped. Finally, at 11:30, Bray called back and said they had him in custody. The arrest had happened without incident, and Norris was transported back to face charges. The next day, Detective Bray came to Jude's house and showed me the booking photo on his tablet. Sean Norris stared at the camera with dead eyes, and I felt a wave of relief. So strong my knees went weak. He couldn't come after me now. He was in jail and I was safe. But right behind the relief came a surge of fear about having to face him in court. Monica Haney had warned me his lawyer would try to make me look bad, and now that was going to happen. At least he was locked up and couldn't hurt anyone else. Agent Fournier interviewed Norris over the next few days and then called to update me on what he'd learned. He said the kidnapping ring had been watching me for weeks before they grabbed me off the street. They knew my jogging route and my schedule. They knew when I left for work and when I came home. Norris had admitted they planned to take me to a remote location and that I wasn't supposed to survive. Fournier said Norris showed no emotion when describing what they'd intended to do to me. Hearing those details made me physically sick, and I had to hang up the phone and run to the bathroom. I threw up everything in my stomach and then sat on the floor shaking. The fact that they'd been watching me for weeks meant they'd seen me living my normal life with no idea I was hunted. That thought was somehow worse than everything that had happened in the van. At my next therapy session with Lexi, I brought up what Agent Fournier had told me about being watched for weeks. She sat forward in her chair and explained that knowing the facts could actually help with recovery, because it takes away the uncertainty. I told her I wasn't sure that helped at all, since now I kept imagining them following me to work and watching me through my windows. She said those thoughts were normal, but we needed to work on separating what actually happened from what my brain was creating to fill in the gaps. I kept going to therapy twice a week because the nightmares were still constant, and I'd wake up every night thinking someone was in my room. A few days later, Detective Bray called and said Reed Cotton wanted to meet with me again. Reed had learned more about his brother's involvement in the kidnapping ring and wanted to apologize in person. I was hesitant because our first meeting had been so awkward and painful, but something about the way Bray described Reed's grief made me agree. We met at the same coffee shop with Detective Bray sitting at a nearby table. Reed looked less shocked this time and more tired, like he hadn't been sleeping well. He told me his brother had gotten involved with bad people after losing his construction job 6 months ago. The family had tried to help him, but he'd pushed everyone away, and they didn't know about the kidnapping plot until the police showed up at their door. Reed said his parents were ashamed and heartbroken, and they wanted me to know they didn't blame me for defending myself. He pulled out a photo of his brother from before everything went wrong and showed me a guy who looked normal and happy. That made it harder somehow because it reminded me that the men in the van had been real people with families who loved them. Reed thanked me for meeting him and said talking to me helped him understand that his brother had made terrible choices that led to terrible consequences. After he left, I sat in my car for 20 minutes trying to process how that conversation had lifted some of the guilt I'd been carrying around. The next week, Prosecutor Haney called and asked me to come to her office. She had a thick file folder on her desk when I arrived, and explained that Norris was charged with kidnapping, attempted murder, and connection to the other homicides. The trial might not happen for months or even a year, but she needed me to be ready to testify about every detail of what happened in the van. She walked me through the kinds of questions I'd be asked, and warned me that Norris's defense lawyer would try to make me look bad. They'd probably argue I used too much force by causing the crash that killed 2 men. I felt my stomach turn at the thought of having to defend saving my own life in front of a jury. Haney said she would fight that story hard, but I needed to be prepared for them to attack my actions and my character. A month after the kidnapping, I finally worked up the courage to go back to my apartment with Jude. He insisted on coming with me and checking every room before I went inside. Walking through my front door made my heart race and my hands shake. Everything looked exactly the same as the morning I'd left for my jog, but it all felt wrong now. I grabbed clothes from my closet and threw them in a suitcase while Jude packed up my bathroom stuff. We were in and out in 20 minutes because I couldn't stand being there any longer. Sitting in Jude's car outside the building, I realized I could never live there again. The kidnappers had watched me there and knew where I slept, and that made the whole place feel dirty and unsafe. I started looking at new apartments the next day, and found one in a building with better security across town. The building had cameras at every entrance and exit, plus a security guard in the lobby at night. Adriana and Jude helped me move my stuff from the old place and set up the new apartment. Adriana brought over some plants, and Jude installed extra locks on the door and windows. The new apartment had cameras I could check from my phone and multiple deadbolts, and it felt safer than anywhere I'd been since the kidnapping. Detective Bray called a week later with news that Norris was trying to make a deal by giving information about the other members of the kidnapping ring. The FBI had arrested 2 more people connected to the other murders based on what Norris told them. Bray said my escape had helped solve cases that had been cold for months, and brought some closure to other families. Knowing that something good came from the worst day of my life gave me a weird sense of purpose I hadn't expected. I started having good days mixed in with the bad ones over the next few weeks. Some mornings I woke up without immediately thinking about the van or checking all my locks 3 times. Lexi said this was progress and that healing wasn't straight up, but more like a zigzag with good days and setbacks. I was learning to be patient with myself and not expect to be completely fine right away. 5 weeks after the kidnapping, Prosecutor Haney called and said Norris wanted to plead guilty to avoid trial. He was offering to accept life in prison without parole in exchange for not making me testify about what happened. She asked what I wanted to do and said either choice was valid. The idea of not having to face Norris in court was incredibly appealing because I'd been dreading that for weeks. But part of me also wanted him to hear directly from me what he put me through, and how his actions destroyed my sense of safety. I told Haney I would testify if she needed me to, but I wouldn't stand in the way of a plea deal that guaranteed he never got out of prison. She said she'd let me know what Norris decided after talking to his lawyer. 2 days later, Haney called and said Norris took the deal. He would plead guilty to kidnapping and attempted murder and accept life in prison without parole plus extra time for his connection to the other murders. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out, and Haney wanted me to read a victim impact statement if I felt ready. I spent the next 3 weeks writing and rewriting what I wanted to say. The words needed to be right because this was my only chance to tell Norris directly what he did to me. On the morning of the sentencing, I put on a dark blue dress and Jude drove me to the courthouse. Adriana met us there and sat next to me in the gallery. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lights that buzzed. Norris was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked thinner than in his mugshot, and he kept his eyes on the floor. The judge was an older woman with gray hair who spoke in a calm, steady voice. She asked if Norris understood the terms of his plea agreement, and he said yes without looking up. Then she asked if I wanted to read my statement. I walked to the podium on shaky legs with my written pages. I looked directly at Norris and started reading. I described the morning he grabbed me off the street and how I fought for my life in that van. I talked about the nightmares and the fear and how I couldn't go back to my own apartment. I explained that he stole my sense of safety and made me afraid of the world. My voice shook, but I kept going. I said he chose to hurt people and now he would spend his life in prison because of those choices. Norris never looked at me the whole time. He stared at the table in front of him with his jaw clenched. When I finished reading, the judge thanked me and asked if I wanted to return to my seat. I walked back to Adriana feeling stronger than I had in weeks. The judge sentenced Norris to life without parole plus 40 additional years. She said his actions were calculated and cruel, and that he showed no remorse. The bailiff led him out through a side door, and he was gone. I sat there feeling like I could breathe properly for the first time since the kidnapping. Adriana squeezed my hand, and Jude put his arm around my shoulders. Outside the courthouse, Haney told me I did great and that my statement was powerful. She said the case was closed now, and Norris would never be free again. I thanked her for everything, and she shook my hand before heading back inside. The next day, I had a session with Lexi and told her about the sentencing. She asked how I felt speaking directly to Norris, and I said it made me feel powerful. He couldn't hurt me anymore, and I got to tell him exactly what he put me through. Lexi explained that closure doesn't mean forgetting what happened, but it does mean I can move forward without waiting for something to resolve. The legal part was done, and now I could focus on healing. She asked if I felt ready to return to work, and I said I wanted to try. My boss had been patient, but I needed routine again. I needed to feel normal. Lexi said that was healthy, and we scheduled our next appointment for the following week instead of twice a week. 6 weeks after the kidnapping, I walked into the medical clinic where I worked. My coworkers hugged me and told me they were glad I was back. My boss took me to a back office away from the main patient areas and said I could work there until I felt more comfortable. He gave me billing files to process and said to take breaks whenever I needed. Sitting at that desk with spreadsheets in front of me felt amazing. I was doing something normal and productive. My hands still shook sometimes, but I focused on the work and the hours passed. At lunch, I ate in the break room with 2 coworkers who asked gentle questions about how I was doing. I told them I was getting better slowly, and they said to let them know if I needed anything. Having people around who cared made the day easier. That weekend, Adriana took me out to dinner to celebrate getting through the sentencing. We went to a Mexican restaurant we used to go to all the time before the kidnapping. Sitting across from her in a booth felt like old times. She ordered margaritas and raised her glass. She said she was proud of my strength and everything I'd survived. I felt tears in my eyes because I was proud of myself too. I fought back when it mattered most, and I was still here building my life. We talked about normal things like her job and a guy she was dating. It felt good to focus on something other than trauma. When we left the restaurant, I hugged her tight and thanked her for being there through everything. She said that's what best friends do. Over the next few weeks, Jude gradually stopped hovering over me so much. He still checked in daily, but he wasn't showing up unannounced or insisting on going everywhere with me. His wife told me one afternoon that he had been terrified of losing me, and that's why he was so intense. She said watching me get stronger helped him relax. I was grateful he was there when I needed him most, even if his protectiveness felt overwhelming sometimes. I started going to the gym near my apartment and using the treadmill. The thought of running outside alone still made my chest tight with fear, but Lexi said I might get there eventually. For now, jogging indoors with other people around felt like enough progress. I started with 20 minutes at a slow pace and gradually built up my endurance. The familiar rhythm of running helped clear my head. Other gym members smiled at me, and a few regulars started saying hello. Being around people doing normal activities made me feel connected to regular life again. One morning after my workout, I checked my mailbox and found a letter forwarded through Detective Bray. It was from Reed Cotton. He thanked me for meeting with him and said it helped him process his brother's death and his family's shame. He wrote that his family started a foundation to help families affected by violent crime. They wanted something good to come from the terrible thing his brother did. Reading his words made me cry because it showed that healing was possible even for the families of people who hurt others. I wrote back thanking him for reaching out and wishing his family peace. 2 months after the kidnapping, I woke up one morning feeling actually rested. I lay in bed realizing I'd slept through the whole night without nightmares. It was the first time since that morning in the van. I got up and made coffee and sat by my window watching the sunrise. The healing was happening slowly, but it was happening. I wasn't fixed, but I was getting better. That same week, Detective Bray called with news. He said the FBI closed the other kidnapping cases thanks to information from Norris and the people they arrested. 2 families got answers about their missing daughters, even though the answers were heartbreaking. Both women had been murdered by the same ring that tried to take me. Bray said my survival and escape led to solving those cases. I felt sick thinking about those women who didn't make it out, but I was also glad their families finally knew what happened and could start to find closure. My fighting back in that van meant something bigger than just my own survival. It helped stop these people from hurting anyone else and gave other families answers they desperately needed. A few weeks later, one of my coworkers asked if I wanted to grab dinner after work. His name was Clay, and we'd been chatting more during lunch breaks. I said yes before my brain could talk me out of it. We met at a casual Italian place near the office, and I focused on keeping my breathing steady. He talked about his weekend hiking trip and asked about my interests. I told him about running on treadmills at the gym and how I was getting back into reading. My hands stayed calm on the table, and I didn't check the exits compulsively. We shared a pizza, and he made me laugh with stories about his disaster of a roommate. When dinner ended, I realized I'd gone 2 hours without thinking about the van or the crash. Driving home, I felt proud of myself for showing up and staying present. Clay texted later saying he had a great time and wanted to do it again. I wrote back that I'd like that too. The next morning, I met with Lexi for my regular Thursday session. She asked how I was doing, and I told her about the date. She smiled and said that was a significant step forward. We talked about my sleep patterns and how the nightmares had decreased to maybe once a week. She brought up the idea of reducing our sessions from twice weekly to once weekly. I felt a small spike of anxiety at the thought of less support. Lexi reminded me that progress often means learning to manage on my own, and that setbacks were completely normal. She said I could always schedule extra sessions if I needed them. I agreed to try once a week starting next month. Walking out of her office, I felt ready to handle more independently. 3 months had passed since that morning on the highway. I drove to the location where the van had crashed. The road looked completely normal with cars zooming past. There was no evidence anything violent had happened there. I parked on the shoulder and got out. Standing on the exact spot where I'd crawled from the wreckage made my heart pound, but in a different way than before. I'd saved my own life right here on this stretch of asphalt. The fear I expected didn't come. Instead, I felt powerful and alive. I stayed for 10 minutes just breathing and remembering that I'd fought back and won. When I got back in my car, I felt lighter. That weekend, I reached out to 3 friends I'd been avoiding since the kidnapping. Sarah and Miguel and Tasha had all texted multiple times, but I'd kept making excuses about being busy. I invited them over to my new apartment for lunch. They showed up with food and hugs and didn't push me to talk about what happened. We caught up on their lives and normal gossip about people we knew. Sarah was planning a wedding and showed me photos of dresses. Miguel had started a new job in marketing. Tasha was dating someone she really liked. Being around them felt like reclaiming a part of myself I'd lost. When they left, I realized how much I'd missed having my social life back. A letter arrived in my mailbox a few days later, forwarded through the police department. Agent Fournier had written to thank me for my cooperation during the investigation. He said my bravery in fighting back had directly prevented future victims. The letter included information about victim services and support groups if I ever needed additional resources. Reading his words made me feel like the violence and trauma had resulted in something meaningful. I wrote a brief thank you note back. At the gym, I noticed a flyer for self-defense classes starting the following week. I signed up before I could overthink it. The first class had 8 other women and 1 male instructor. He introduced himself and explained we'd learn practical techniques for dangerous situations. My hands shook during the first demonstration, but I made myself stay. The instructor noticed my tension and pulled me aside after class. I told him I'd been through something and had triggers around physical confrontation. He said he'd work with me at my own pace and help me through the fear responses. Over the next few weeks, the classes started feeling less scary and more empowering. Learning proper defensive moves made me feel more prepared and confident. 4 months after the kidnapping, I was doing well at my job. My boss called me into her office one afternoon. She said she'd been impressed with my work and wanted to offer me a promotion to a supervisory role. The position came with more responsibility and better pay. I accepted immediately. Moving forward in my career felt like reclaiming the future that had almost been stolen from me. I'd be managing a small team and helping train new hires. Starting the new role next month gave me something positive to focus on. Clay and I had been on 5 dates by then. We were at dinner when I decided I needed to tell him what happened. I explained about the kidnapping attempt and the crash and everything that followed. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he reached across the table and squeezed my hand. He said he was sorry I'd gone through that and thanked me for trusting him enough to share it. He didn't treat me like I was broken or damaged. He didn't ask intrusive questions or make it weird. We took things slow after that, but I felt hopeful about where the relationship might go. His reaction meant everything to me. Jude and his wife invited me over for dinner on a Friday night. We ate lasagna and talked about normal things like their upcoming vacation and a movie they'd seen. Nobody mentioned the kidnapping or asked how I was coping. Being able to just exist without everything revolving around trauma felt like the biggest milestone yet. Jude's wife showed me photos from their anniversary trip. We played a board game after dinner and I laughed until my stomach hurt. Driving home that night, I felt genuinely content. 6 months had passed since that morning when I was grabbed off the street. I woke up one Saturday feeling genuinely happy with my life. I still had hard days and probably always would, but I wasn't defined by what happened to me anymore. I'd fought back when it mattered, and now I was building a life I felt proud of. The nightmares were rare now, and I slept well most nights. Clay was coming over later, and we were going to cook dinner together. My promotion started Monday, and I was excited about the challenge. Therapy with Lexi once a week kept me grounded. I had my friends back, and my relationship with Jude felt solid. Standing in my kitchen making coffee, I looked out the window at the city and felt grateful to be alive. I'd survived, and now I was thriving.